And I view the Serpent Priestess as being the highest mastery of all of the Venusian aspects, because she has to have all of the other aspects fully integrated, essentially, to operate in that capacity. And the Serpent Priestess, from just what I've remembered and from what I've seen in the records and things like that, there's a range of serpent priestesses and what they would have done. They would have all held different roles depending on the time period, depending on the culture that they were in, and what was required, even in the collective at that time. But the serpent priestess energy that I tune into for this archetype is the highest mastery. And this, if we can develop this, we can change the entire planet. And doing it in our personal life is where it starts.
Hello and welcome back, beautiful travel enthusiasts. I have a very special guest today, Aly Wilkins. Aly is an ancient new priestess sister that I met on the path through our joint remembering of the sacred feminine. She's an oracle. She reads the Akashic records, and she also has an amazing YouTube channel. So please go ahead and check that out. And welcome, Aly. I am excited to have you here and to have you contribute with your beautiful wisdom to this channel.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited for this conversation with you.
I am excited too. And, well, before we head into the conversation, I'll let you say a couple of words to you and how that Priestess Path found you. So would you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Sure. So, hi, everyone. I'm Aly Wilkins. I'm an oracle. I'm a mystic, a teacher of the ancient feminine, an Akashic records practitioner, and also a writer. And really, my whole mission has evolved over the years, but it's always been deeply connected to the goddess tradition. And now, for the last 5 years or so, it's really been anchored in remembering and embodying the ancient feminine, remembering who, as feminines, but also just as in our feminine energy, who we were pre-patriarchy and how we operated, and doing the work to look at all of the programs that have been installed, all of the ways that our feminine energy has been shrunken down, and supporting people, as well as I'm going through this myself, and then I just share what I've learned, essentially, and work with my oracular gifts to help other people in expanding into our ancient feminine essence. And I think that's what the world needs, and also it just supports us so greatly in coming back to our fullness. So that's what I'm here to do.
Just a casual, like priestess introduction. I love that. Thank you. I don't even know where to start. Maybe let's start with the Venus path. How have you, in your own life, in a very maybe tangible way, how do you connect to the Venus path?
Well, I think as with many things when we're awakening, things find us before we realize what they are. The first energy that came to me was Lakshmi in 2016, and she absolutely represents Venus. She's not usually, a lot of times when we're talking about the Venus path, we're thinking about the rose lineage, but any fertility goddess would be connected to that energy. And so she found me first and worked with me specifically on bringing in abundance through my soul work. And there's a big hornet just sitting on my laptop right now that just flew in. I'm like, "That's not Lakshmi." But anyway, so yeah, Lakshmi found me first, and my first sort of work in bringing my soul further online, further installed in my body, I guess you could say, more active, was making sure that the work that I was doing in the world was contributing to a higher good. And so first that looked like a large process of leaving my corporate job, and like many of us have this similar story of wanting to make money in a way that feels fulfilling, wanting to contribute in a way that feels like it's using our gifts and all of that. And so that was the first sort of layer of that, which isn't the typical Venus path. However, Lakshmi is a part of that. And then after that, there was a much larger initiation through romance and through the twin flame activations. And really brought me directly into the rose lineage.
Mm.
So for the last 5 or 6 years, I've just been working very deeply with the Venus path. I forgot the original question because I just
No, you're perfectly on it. It was like about
okay.
how Venus and her living map shows up in your own life.
Yeah, yeah. And we were talking in the YouTube video we did the other day about how Magdalene or how so many of these different beings work with us in so many different layers. So like the way that the Venus path has shown up for me is going to be totally different than how it might look for someone else because it's interacting with different areas of the heart, of the womb, of our soul gifting that we're each going to have different programs around. We're each going to have different ways that, blockages or things of that nature that we need to address first with it. But yeah, I'm just really passionate now about the fullness and the depth of the Venus path as a spiritual ascension tool. And one of the things that I've noticed is that it just feels as if it's being taught from a very surface level and we're ready collectively. I mean, just thinking about the last few years, the divine feminine has risen so much. And now we're ready collectively for the deeper initiation of this path.
Mm, I love it. And it's important what you say because I feel that I would want to maybe draw the circle a little bit bigger about how how we actually see Venus as being connected to the Sacred Travel podcast because it is, and you said it, like the Venus path as a spiritual ascension tool. I love that. By the way, I've never heard anybody refer to it as such, but that's actually totally what it is. And so there is, of course, a whole methodology around it, but basically also like Venus as this living map in and onto herself as she like traverses the sky making this pentagram or the cosmic rose, but it's actually also a mirror in our own bodies. And I want you to talk into this in a little while as well, but I just feel that I want to make the connection so it's literally like a living map, also depending on whether you really like want to consciously live with her cycles and the connections that she makes with the moon that are mirroring our chakras. So at each of these points, you can absolutely attune to this higher wisdom that opens up in each portal. And then it's also very much connected to a lot of these goddess traditions, right? With like Inanna, Arishka Gal, and basically all the goddesses who journey like through the underworld. It's all a mirror of like the path that Venus as a planet makes in the sky versus also the mythology and how it shows up in our own lives. And so I know that you are also following quite a specific methodology that you have even developed, if that's true. So can you speak a little bit into this? It is time for you to remember who you truly are. It is time for you to remember why you came here and to step fully and wholeheartedly into the purpose that you, as a starseed, came to carry out here. Journey with me to places where this remembrance is a living, accessible library and a memory bank for yourself to retrieve into your own body. Whether you went to travel the star map of Egypt or the Magdalene coatings in the south of France, or receive powerful and potent light body activations in the Valley of Light in Switzerland, all three experiences are carefully crafted for you to walk where the earth remembers you and where you remember the earth. Check out the sacred travel experiences with me in this year.
Yeah. Well, a couple of years ago, I had like a really deep, dark feminine awakening. And I started just recognizing, well, I'll just say it this way. I started creating curriculum because I'm a teacher. That's my role. I started creating curriculum around, I call this full spectrum feminine, looking at all of the different aspects of our femininity because the dark feminine has been so buried and has been so like where we as women are keeping her in a lock and key, like deep in the basement. Like, no, she's, kind of like in the olden days when a child would be born disabled or something, or like disfigured or something of that nature, and they would like keep her or him up in the attic and like no one could see it. That's how we treat the dark feminine so often. And she's so vital and important to us. And just like you were saying, how Venus moves into the underworld, Venus is known as the mother of demons. Like, that's one of her, you would never guess that based on how she's often depicted, but this is a large part of her role in mothering and nursing demons, our internal demons, or even non-human beings into love. That's a massive part of her role. And so we can do the same with our own dark feminine aspect. And so I came into this really because I was recognizing, like, and now this is more well known, but this was like 2 or 3 years ago when I feel like people weren't really talking about this. It was like, why is all of the depictions of femininity where these are like approved by the patriarchy? All of the things that we're being taught, even in terms of the dark feminine, like, oh, be the femme fatale,
Mm.
or the seductive aspect, or the really sensual and sexual aspect. They're all things that don't disrupt the patriarchy. And the dark feminine is like, I actually want to obliterate the patriarchy into love, restoring it into what will be of greatest harmony for all of us, because it's not helping anyone. So I created this methodology looking at what is the best way for us to start to tap into these different embodiments in an accessible way. Because when you awaken the dark feminine, like, she is big. Like, it takes a long time to learn to really work with her with mastery. And so I wanted to figure out what's the best way for us to integrate her into our life, as well as the other aspects of femininity that we might have discomfort with, or we might be like, "Ooh," like, just as an example, the muse for me a few years ago, like, I grew up with all these stories about women who want attention and just be quiet and smart, and, like, don't try to get too much attention from anyone. And so I noticed when I started looking at the muse archetype, I noticed, like, all of these familial programmings that I had no idea were even there, and I always had a lot of resistance to the muse or to being the muse, and I didn't understand why. And so through this, first, anything that I'm creating, I always test it out myself and do the curriculum myself. And I'm like, "Is this good? Is this not good?" And it just supported me so greatly. So I found that it's easiest for us to learn how to really integrate these energies and see in a way that's not gonna, like, blow up our life, in a way that it's like a smooth, easeful integration as much as possible, to look at specific archetypes that are embodying these certain energies. And through that, we can see, where are my edges? Where am I uncomfortable? What
Mm.
stories am I uncovering? But through the framework of having, like, okay, this is what the ancient muse did, just as an example. This is how she operated. This is what her belief systems would have been like. How does that feel for you? Where do we feel like we are stretched? And what is a little stretch we can do to step more into that? And it's like a manageable way that we can start to stretch ourselves in a way that doesn't just like break us, or everything flips upside down and inside out and it's like tumultuous, but in a graceful way that we're steering the ship.
I think we can all need that.
Yeah.
Wow. So, and you also referred to it as, it's actually activating the Venusian priestess mysteries, as also I want to almost say, like, were originally taught in the temples, even going back, and that also is connecting back to ancient civilizations, whether we look to Sumeria or Greece or Egypt. And what have you found maybe also as rituals who are supporting this path?
Well, I want to speak first to, like, looking at all of these different cultures. For me, it's all about, before we had the patriarchal program installed, how did we operate? And that would have been it would have been different based on different cultures, of course. But it also, like, we wouldn't have had so many of these very specific beliefs, even looking at, for example, the amount of work we have to do as women to overcome all of the marketing and all of the programs around our body image and that we're supposed to look a certain way. And I did a program years ago called Infinite Beauty that we were talking so much about, like, I'm a 90s baby. I was born in 1990. And like my mom in the closet had, lean cuisines. And I don't know if it's the same if you guys have all this in other countries, but, all these like diet things and everything was about working out and like, but not for our health so that we would be skinny. This is just one example of like, is a child born in an indigenous tribe who hasn't encountered any of that programming, like, what does she feel about her body? I'm sure she's not like, "Oh, the size of my pants matters," or,
Yeah. Yeah.
no, she so we that's just one example of, like, the severity of the depth of these programs that the patriarchy has brought in, and everyone can relate to the body image thing no matter what gender you identify
Yes.
as. But I wanna go into your question about rituals too. What specifically do you mean by that?
The way that I feel about it is that ritual really connects us back to our bodies, and it connects us back to being that sacred vessel and that embodiment of an archetype or an archetypal energy, so we can really become it. So is there anything that you would advise or that you have experienced that supported you around that?
So many. So many. For me, like, working with the different archetypes, there would be different rituals for each one.
Yeah.
The way that I teach it very specifically is I work with themes. And so within each theme of an archetype, there would be different rituals. So with the lover, for example, that's the first archetype we start with when I'm teaching this with the Venusian path. And a lot of times this would be taught in relation to like loving outside of yourself and being a lover in relationship, being a good lover, or also just having, like compassion and having an open heart and that sort of energy. But when I'm looking at the lover, it's all of it is in relation to ourself. So the energy around self-reverence. And just as an example, a ritual could be sitting down in the morning and writing down. I love working with affirmations. They're like, that sounds super basic, but they just work so well for me. Sitting down in the morning, looking at yourself in the mirror and just being in reverence to yourself, being in reverence to your body, giving yourself eye contact, gazing at yourself as if you like the way that you would want someone else to be gazing at you, right? With deep love and reverence and admiration. And one thing I'm just remembering that I did at the very beginning of this, a lot of times we'll be deeply initiated into the Venus path through heartbreak or through romantic energy. And that's a staple of the Venus path, that romance as a spiritual path, essentially. And I remember I was like alone kind of for the first time. I had been with someone for like 8 years and I was living by myself and I was like, how do I miss being like touched? Not in sexual ways, but just in ways of like, when someone cuddles you or it's like they hold your face. And so I started doing things like that. And that activated something within me of like, I don't need to get this from someone else. I can give it to myself. And starting to touch and love and speak to myself in those same ways that I desired from someone externally. And with the lover, one of her big shadows is like needing that validation from other people without giving it to herself, extorting our value to other people. So that's just one example of a way we can work with rituals with this very particular energy. Yeah, I mean, there's like 50 billion rituals I can think of. I'll stop there.
I love that. Yeah, no, no, no. I agree. So you said that you're starting with the lover. Would you take us through, is it kind of like the wheel of the year, or is that like what map are you covering with the archetypes?
Yeah, so I started doing this, like I was saying, with Full Spectrum Feminine, where we started with in the winter months, like January through March. we started with more of the visionary feminine. That's a time when we're sitting in stillness. We're not supposed to be doing a zillion things. We're in hibernation mode. However, we can still be weaving the dream and sitting in stillness and noticing what comes up. So when you talk about the wheel of the year, this is sort of the way that I work with the archetypes seasonally. And the springtime is really when we bring in the Venus energy. And of course, we just had, like, if you're listening to this right when it comes out, Venus just came out of retrograde. A lot of us were really affected by that because she has such strong energy. And but even just looking at the spring months, we're starting to, oh, like it's springtime again. It's things are moving and things are blooming and I have more energy now and I'm coming back to life. And so we start with the lover. I feel she's really the foundation of the Venusian path. And oftentimes that is what's being taught in a lot of these Venusian temples. However, like I was saying, I always just had this resistance to how it was being taught. And it reminded me of like when I was a little girl and I would go to church and I was like, something's missing. They're not telling the full truth here. I don't like it. Like if somebody tells you a story and they're leaving out a massive chunk of it so you don't get the full picture, and it's like, I don't know, something feels a little off about this, like, I don't you just have this internal feeling, and that's how I felt about how Venus was being represented because it was just the heavenly Venus, which is I'm not demeaning that at all, that's a massive aspect of the Venusian path, but again, a lot of my work gears around, like, rewiring our patriarchal program, and so when we're looking at the feminine ways of being, so many of them, it's like, well, you can extend yourself into the lover who's devoted to the husband or who's devoted to the partner, who gives herself endlessly. Like, we're not bothered by that. You can be that, And so we start with the lover as the foundational aspect, but not necessarily in relationship to external, in relationship to ourself and
Mm.
developing self-reverence. And a lot of times just even hearing that term, people might be like, "Oh, well, that's cocky. I shouldn't feel that way about myself," or "I don't wanna be self-centered or vain," because there's, of course, so much programming around that. And it's like, I'm allowed to love myself, like, that's okay. It's actually pretty healthy for me to just like who I am? So we're working with the art of self-reverence, but taking it to this degree that isn't going into arrogance, it's just truly seeing yourself. So we go from the lover then into the muse, which does take it a little bit more the way that I work with this, it gets a little bit more powerful with each archetype. And so there's new programs and new shadows and new beliefs that come up when we look at each of these. And so the muse, we're taking it a little bit more externally. And this is where the muse you might think of as like, oh, she's the inspiration for an artist. But she's actually so much more than that. The muse is inspiring. The muse is so original and so different, and I don't think people recognize this aspect of the muse. She is, like, different from everybody else, and so I'm sure everyone listening to this can resonate with the idea of, like, I feel different, I feel misunderstood, or I feel like I'm not the same as everyone else. I'm operating on a different path. I'm not following this, like, matrix's plan, or I think differently, or whatever it might be, or I'm weird, or the muse takes that and owns it, and she's like, "Yeah, doesn't that make me so fun?" And she owns it, but she's using it in a capacity that it's inspiring culture. So you can think about, like, probably everyone is familiar with Marilyn Monroe. And she was like, during her time period, women were like domestic housewives with pies when their husband came home from work wearing aprons and taking their like prescription pills so that they could dull their feelings and stay in that space. And she's this like vixen with, her curves showing tight clothing, like wear like a totally different energy than the feminine was in that day and age, which I think we, again, don't recognize now because it's like, "Oh, well,
Mm.
that we dress like that now. That's not," or we might hold that more of that energy now. But at the time, that like, women were like there's even that famous picture, I think it's with Sophia Loren, where she's kinda giving her the side eye. But Marilyn Monroe then you look at, okay, she That was like the 1950s, 1960s, I believe. Then you look at, okay, the 60s and 70s, there's this huge feminine awakening where all of a sudden we're having an opening in relation to our sexuality, into sexual freedom, into what we're wearing, like into the ways we're acting in the world. And it's not that Marilyn Monroe like started that whole thing. However, it's one seed, just like we're all seeds that create
Mm,
momentum. So the muse, it's like she's inspiring cultural change.
yeah.
And
I almost feel like she's that breath of creation.
yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. Yeah,
Go
so
ahead. That was just like my musings.
yeah. So there's a lot of different ways we can work with the muse too. That's just kind of one of the examples. And so then after that, we go into the erotic feminine. And this is where we go deep into the womb and deep into the primordial power of the feminine, which of course has been so forgotten. And there's a lot of connection with that with the dark feminine because she's rooted in the power of the earth. She's rooted in the power of Earth's womb. And that relates, of course, to our womb. And when we look at ancient cultures, they all celebrated their menstrual cycles. It was
Mm,
a time of deep reverence for women, and they worked with their blood. So we're talking about that in relation to the erotic feminine, but also working with our erotic energy, not just in sexuality, because that's one way we can work with it, but it's almost like I want to say it's like the most shallow way, which that's not coming from me. That isn't necessarily the way I would put it. That's spoken through me in this moment. But our erotic energy, we can use it for so many different things, and we have like no awareness of this.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
started like, 5 years ago of different ways that we can use our life force energy. And so that's what the erotic feminine is really about. And with that, a lot, so many people, so many of us have deep religious programming or deep religious trauma, deep sexual trauma, things that block us off from that erotic energy, even as children thinking about, like, when you were caught sexually or you were caught in some capacity with your sexual energy for the first time, just exploring or being curious, and there's usually for most people, there's a demonization immediately, and it's like, "Oh, it's this energy's not safe. I can't show anybody this. I have to keep this locked behind closed doors," and it from childhood, like, that creates a lot of and there's just so many other things too that contribute to the loss of our erotic innocence or even just the lack of understanding of how to work with that. And so this is where we start with Venus, we start to get into these deeper realms where, like, the lover and the muse are very I would say they're like upper chakras. They can be more external facing. And when we continue to move along this, I like how you called it this wheel because I haven't thought of it that way, but it is. When we move into these next three aspects, we're getting into the deep primordial power and learning how to use that with integrity. So, by the way, interrupt me because I know I'm just going on and on with this. So let me know if you want to share anything.
I love it, and I'm listening closely because I mean, both of us we know that we are doing similar work, and I also this year I'm not running a full year program, but the way that I teach it is a little bit different. And also the archetypes that are present for me in each month and like throughout the year are different. But of course, like it's also again the coming back to the full spectrum. So I love how there is there is not just like one truth, and an archetypal energy can be connected and can be used and accessed in various different forms. And what I'm hearing from you, it's almost like we're using different or opposite axes, which are also true if you look at the zodiac or like other themes. And so I just find it fascinating how we can all tap into those energies and work with them in an aligned way, how it feels right and truthful in our own bodies.
Mm, yeah, and we all need it from a different angle. Like we need to learn from a different angle. You know what I mean? Like so yeah, like you were saying, there can be different truths that are all true, different ways of looking at it, different angles of approaching it. And yeah. So after the erotic feminine, then we go into this is the archetype that I've created and I feel like very protective and possessive over it. And so I call her the high seductress because
Ooh.
I always had a lot of, again, the same feeling of like, I don't really vibe with this. I don't really like it. When people would talk about how the dark feminine, how the femme fatale was being represented. And it's because I'm a person who's deeply rooted in integrity, which I know many of you probably are who are listening. Like that's one of my highest values. And when I looked at the femme fatale, it was just like she's operating from a place of shadow. She's operating from a place of pain. And I I ran this course, The Realm of the Dark Feminine, one year, and I asked everyone which archetype. We were working with some different archetypes there. And I asked everyone, what is the archetype that you feel the most resistance towards? And everyone, like 98% of people said the or they said the high seductress because they thought it was the femme fatale. So I sat in the records and I was like, tell me about this. What's this about? Like, why is everybody feeling so resistant to the seductress energy? And this was before I coined it the high seductress, actually. So just the seductress energy was what people were feeling like resistant to or scared to step into. And what my guides told me was because if you're deeply rooted in integrity, you don't want to be using seduction as a way to hurt other people. The
Mm.
definition of the femme fatale is essentially a woman who is getting pleasure from hurting other people, from hurting other men, from using her power to hurt others. And there's the femme fatale also, I wanna say, like, this emanation of the dark feminine, a lot of the way the dark feminine has been taught is just with that energy, where it's like, okay, learn these seduction techniques so that you can get whatever you want, no matter how it affects someone else. And that's where the resistance can come in. However, that energy sometimes is very powerful for us to step into for a short period of time when we're overcoming like the people pleaser or we're overcoming codependency or learn. So it's not that it's like all bad. It's just that I call Venus the high feminine mastery because she's not operating from this wounded place. The femme fatale, if she's looking to create power in a way that might harm others, that is not the high feminine energy. That's coming from a place of pain. So I sat with that and I was like, and I just was delivered sort of from Inanna, the high seductress. And how does the high seductress operate? She knows how to work with all of the depth of her power. And you guys can't see this, but I have my hands like down at the ground, like the deep, dark, underworld, primordial power that is raw and ravenous and fierce and like also soft and also, all of the different things. But learning how to work with that in an aspect of integrity that can offer us power, and doing that in a way that we can insert it into the modern world so that we're working with high power as in our feminine energy. So we're not having to lean on like all of this over masculinized energy to get what we want. We're working with the feminine so that we can feel in tune with our innate way of being in a way that delivers us great power, but for the highest good of all. And I
Yeah.
was like, get behind that. And so, yeah.
I have a question for you here because, especially like with the aspects that you've been speaking about, sometimes those shadow aspects I feel really come in disguise. And especially or also in spiritual communities or spiritual teachings when you have that aspect of the and we are getting away from that, but there's still traits I feel about, I want to call it like the guru teacher aspect, where we're moving from this hierarchical to really like towards circle and being the mirror for each other. So what would you recommend? How can we detect these shadowy aspects in our own lives that might be a little bit trickier to access?
Yeah, that's a big question. For me, it's so helpful when I'm looking at information or looking at like a way of being and I'm looking at how does this feel in my body and then something will pop up. It's kind of like, if you were saying, "Okay, I want to make $1 million this month." all of that, the thoughts that tell you can't do it, or all of your own inner demons of like doubt, or like nobody wants to pay you that much, like, what do you mean? Or like all of those things will arise to the surface when they're faced with something that is higher and bigger than it. And by that, I don't mean like better than, I mean the ultimate truth. So it's kind of like if you're faced in a mirror, like you'll see the pimple on your face, or you'll see the mascara running down from you crying. When we're faced with the mirror image of it, the shadow will reveal itself. I don't think we have to necessarily go and dig for them. I don't think I think oftentimes it can be difficult for us to find them that way because we're not aware of them. They're blind spots. So other people can act as our
I
mirrors
love
for sure.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good one. So I'm just going to repeat that. The shadow will reveal itself.
Yeah, I think if we're digging for it, it's like we're not really gonna find it in its
Mhm.
true core. There is something coming in though too that we can say like with love, whatever might be stopping me from feeling this energy, please reveal yourself. I wanna have a conversation with you.
Yeah.
The other thing with Venus, just thinking about how she relates to her shadow, she's like, "Oh, my little my little demon child. You're a perfect being." She's not looking at her inner demons, like your jealousy or your insecurity or your fear of failure or whatever it might be. She's not looking at that as a problem. She's like, "Oh, you're perfect. What do you have to teach me? Let's sit down and have tea and have a conversation." And so learning how to interact with our shadows from that capacity changes everything because then we're not making it wrong and it feels more comfortable to show itself and to sit with it without making it worse by, making ourselves feel bad or like I should be beyond this by now. It's like, no, I just have tea every week with this and I learn something every time. And the shadow is shifting and changing. And now, oh, it's getting a lot lighter now, and it changes over time.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. The Lucifera, the light bringer. So okay, before we drift off too far, maybe you can walk us like
Yeah.
briefly through the rest of the archetypes so we can close that wheel.
Yep. So almost done. So that we have the high seductress. So she's one of my favorite archetypes. I've been working with her for the last year specifically, and she's just so much fun. She's kind of like on Sex in the City, she's sort of like Samantha actually, but she's so powerful. And I don't know that Samantha's like in her highest state of being, I don't know. But she's so powerful, she's sovereign, she knows what she wants, she knows who she is, she has high standards, she's confident, she goes after what she wants, like, that's very high seductress energy, and she's also completely comfortable with every aspect of herself, but she also knows how to wield that power, and so the high seductress is it's a really powerful mastery to develop, and so after that, we go into the serpent priestess. And I view the serpent priestess as being the highest mastery of all of the Venusian aspects because she has to have all of the other aspects fully integrated essentially to operate in that capacity. And the serpent priestess, from just what I've remembered and from what I've seen in the records and things like that, there's a range of serpent priestesses and what they would have done. They would have all held different roles depending on the time period, depending on the culture that they were in, and what was required even in the collective at that time. But the serpent priestess energy that I tune into for this archetype is the highest mastery. And this, if we can develop this, we can change the entire planet. And doing it in our personal life is where it starts. So the serpent priestess would have been typically consorted with kings or with emperors or with high leaders. She either would have been their queen or she would have been like an oracle that was just partnered with the king and he might have had a wife. But she would have been seen as a valued advisor in times where women didn't have really much power. So would be an extremely high honor. Like the king would have seen her as being incredibly valuable for her oracular gifts, but she also was responsible kind of behind the scenes for shaping the way that the king operated, the decisions that he made that affected the entire collective. So she had to have the skill set of, the high seductress, absolutely deeply installed, but taking it to the next level of understanding how to use the power of seduction. And I want to just like reframe even the word seduction, because there's just kind of a certain connotation with that word, at least for me. It's really just manipulating energy. That's all seduction is. And so she would be manipulating the energy in a way that would be for the highest good of the collective. So she would have to understand, how do I speak to this person who, and you might think about these kings who are like leading countless wars and who are creating a lot of destruction on the planet. She has to understand how to work with someone who's being guided by darkness, or who's being guided by greed or conquest or any of those types of things. How does she speak to him so he can hear her? How does she stay knowledgeable and be intelligent enough and be educated enough about, like, she would be like a war advisor in many of these cases, but she would also be advising him on his own shadow, like raising his own shadow into light while she's doing all this. So when we think about bringing this into our modern day or into our own life, it's like, how do we raise the shadow into love and the people we're dealing with? So with ourselves, absolutely, but also with other people. So we look at like this one example is coming in right now for some reason, going into like a very dark corporate environment or something. And I'm not suggesting that we do this. This is just one example of a way we could do it. Like, light workers and priestesses are also needed in these very dark spaces. So if you think about, you go to like, I don't know, like the Google or Tesla, like, main office, like they're the people who are making all these big decisions, I don't know. You go into this corporate environment that's very dark. How can you influence from that space? Or if you're faced off with someone in your life who's incredibly powerful, like, how do we learn how to be with them in a way that we are thinking about our background intention that's for the highest good of all? It's not, the serpent priestess really is selfless. She's not in it for herself. There's not, and that's where I think over time there would have been some falling of that, because she would have had to take care of herself as the feminine was being demolished and destroyed, and the priestesses were all
Mm.
being eradicated, basically. So the timelines of this will shift, but the way we're looking at it is, how do I become the serpent priestess? How do I become not just the light in a space of darkness, but how do I become comfortable enough with darkness that I'm able to sit with it, love it, and like entrain it or persuade it or know how to maneuver around it so that it comes into the light and it creates less damage, like at minimum.
Mm.
So
While also like not being sucked into the darkness, but like being
yes,
able to hold your own frequency. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And
Yeah.
not
It's
on any of that energy too for yourself, which is very easy for us to do, especially as women. If we're interacting with men, there's a whole, one of the priestess paths, one of the large things that many of us used to do is taking the war out of men, taking on their trauma. And that's like a whole different conversation, but we don't have, so exactly what you said. I love that you brought that in, Julia, because it's like not taking that on and knowing how to protect yourself from it, but being able to be with it without being bothered, without it taking over you and sucking you in, like you were saying. So yeah, so that's the wheel of the Venusian path that I take people through in a way that it's like, we're not just learning these esoteric concepts, which are super fascinating and interesting, but we're really bringing it into our embodiment of like, I am the lover. I am in self-reverence to myself. I am a muse. And like the question you were bringing up around shadow, if you sit and say like, I am the high seductress, like, what might come up in you that's like, "Well, actually, I'm really awkward and dorky, so, like, no, I'm not." Or, like, or I am the muse, like, "No, nobody wants to see me." Like, "No, I have visibility issues." Like, the stuff will come up when you bring in
Mm-mm.
a larger concept that it can't survive with. Like, both of them can't survive, so they're gonna kind of, like, fight to see which one will live, and then we get to choose when we see all of it.
Mm. And this is I really feel that this is such a differentiation of the path that we either might like hold as an expectation or a vision of like how spiritual expansion looks like, or still that is taught in some teachings or in some programs. And the past months, it's just so funny that this is coming up now, I feel, because also the past months I've been journeying a lot with what you just shared. And, you know, sometimes still for myself, like I keep this romanticized vision of how stuff looks like even when I go into a rose dieta, sometimes I'm like, oh, it's going to be all like high vibe and I'm only taking in rose. And it was one of my darkest experiences in terms of like this is what I thought that I would get and this is what you actually got. But then looking back, it's like, of course, like everything that is not of that vibration has to leave your body. So like it just needs to go. And it's really the path that you are talking about of this embodiment. And so the more you attune to a certain frequency, to an archetype, to an energy, like stuff will come up. And then it's just the discernment in terms of like, oh, are you like really willing to look into that mirror and to take that demon by the hand and like lead it into the light?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like working with archetypes too because you're like I said at the beginning, you're steering the wheel yourself. So you could like really stretch yourself with something, or you could say, okay, I'm the muse. I'm going to start dressing in a way that feels a little bit of a stretch for me. Like really want to dress, or that might catch, like maybe I'm going to dye my hair blue, or like I've always wanted to dye, maybe it's something small of like, okay, I'm going to start wearing blue eyeliner and I'm going to start like it doesn't have to be like, because we will go through these initiations where I see it as the goddess is like, okay, you're ready, let's go. And it's like, and it's like a lot on our system. But there are other ways we can integrate things that are in small little ways that we feel more comfortable. But then you can also like take it to a higher degree too if you're like, no, I'm ready to transcend this shit. Like I'm ready. So you're in charge of it. And then if it's too much, it's like, okay, let me pull back a little. So it's a way that we can be really consciously integrating new aspects within us in a way that feels safe. Because sometimes with spiritual awakening, I'm sure
Mm,
it doesn't feel safe, or it's like, okay, I know
yeah,
I'm safe. Like I don't feel good right now. I
yeah.
feel my body like I'm all over the place, or this is too much, And so it's not that energy, and which makes it a tangible approach to continuing to develop ourselves over time.
I love that. So where can people sign up? When is the next iteration of the program starting?
Yeah, so I'm going to be doing a masterclass on May 9th. I'm not sure when you guys will be listening to this, but that will be free when it comes out, and then you'll be able to buy it afterwards if you want. That's going to be the orientation actually to the initiation, but it's called the Venus Path, and it's starting May 30th. And we're going to go through a 5-month journey together where we're looking at all the different angles, understanding like the understanding the information behind these archetypes. And because I'm a writer also, I'm very intricate. So you can learn so much just from the way that I'm describing that. And then there's the actual embodiment practices. And then of course, because I'm an oracle, I bring in Akashic Records journeys to support us in integrating in different aspects. And we'll have group calls and sister circles and a Voxer chat. So we'll be in deep communion with each other throughout the entire 5-month experience. So yeah, I'm really, really excited for it. Because I've done this work before with Full Spectrum Feminine, watching people move through the Venusian aspects, and it's just like the Venus energy, when you really apply it in your life, like it just changes so much. Even if you're listening to this and you're like, I'm interested in Venus, like you can develop your own relationship with Venus without doing anything else. And you'll even see just from that, like she brings us so much richness and wealth. And I'm not talking about money necessarily, like richness of spirit and remembering our fullness of self. in our femininity and the aspects that have been forgotten. So she's just so powerful to work with in whatever way you might feel called after listening to this.
I'm buzzing. I just wanna like feed on one aspect. I feel it keeps on coming back. That's why I'm like, okay, this needs to be voiced. When you were speaking about the serpent priestess, there's this one temple in Egypt, in the Temple of Abydos, that is no, sorry, mixing it up. It's like the very south, the very south. Gosh, I see it in front of me, and it's like these twin temples, and it was by Ramses to Queen Nefertari, and you see a lot of the depictions are actually him standing in front of her, so she's behind him, and literally like powering the energy through him. So he is the spokesman, the spokesperson,
Yeah.
but the actual driving force behind, that's she. And she is known to be that, yes, wife of the pharaoh, but also the high priestess, the initiated high priestess. So that's exactly what came through when you were describing that.
I love that you brought that in so
Abu
much.
Simbel, that's the one.
There
Temple
it
of Abu Simbel.
is. Yeah, and one of my favorite things I've learned about the feminine that has been hidden from us, like the ancient feminine, is that what you just said, the queen or the high priestess was the one who bestowed power to the masculine. He couldn't become king without her not just approval, but without her blessing, without her consecration of that. And then even when we look at like Magdalene and Yeshua, that's what she was doing, even before the crucifixion and all of that stuff. So when we look at ourselves as a serpent priestess, it's exactly that energy. Like, how am I the power that is sourcing this and that is helping to guide this? And then the masculine, of course, has all of his own gifts and his own skill sets that he brings in to be able to share that in a very physical, action-oriented leadership capacity. But the feminine, I just love how you said that with that temple.
Wow. Okay. Is there anything else, like any final piece of wisdom that wants to be shared?
Yeah, the last thing I'll say is just our femininity is full spectrum. It's not just one aspect. There's a lot of aspects of our femininity that we think are progressive, but they're actually just the patriarchy has been like, okay, we approve of this because it doesn't disrupt the system that we have. And it goes a lot deeper, and we're allowed to disrupt the cultural norms because that's what has to change in order for the world to change. And that will happen when the feminine rises, when we remember all of these things. And so the purpose of all of this work is just as, looking at the Venusian priestess energy or being a priestess, it's like we're in devotion to not only just the goddess of your choice or the energy of your choice, but to cultivating civilization. And so right now, it just seems like in our world, so much of that is being in a devotion to doing our inner work and like getting ourselves right and remembering our fullness and taking out all the knots so that we can be open and receptive and be in the world as our fullest self. So don't be afraid of the darker aspects. Don't be afraid. Like they're just as needed. We need those aspects of us installed and in their maturity. And the only way to get to the maturity is to open up that cage that I talked about, the dark feminine behind the lock and key. The only way to get to that maturity is to let her out and let her roar and have a temper tantrum and like let her be upset and to just sit there with her and be with her in that. And then later on you create this maturity, which is the purpose of all of the work that I do to develop that within ourselves. Mhm.
Nothing more to add to that in a way. Wow. Aly, thank you so much. That's been really, really deep. And of course, we are going to be putting the link where people can sign up for the masterclass and also then the course itself in the show notes, your Instagram, your website, all of that. And your own YouTube channel. There's a lot of great content. So please, everybody, if you made it until here, please hop over to Aly's show and give it a thumbs up, give it a listen. There's really deep, mature, and high integrity wisdom and information out there. Thank you so much for coming. It's been such a pleasure. And I really look forward to continue weaving beyond our our channels.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia, and to everybody listening.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And as always, stay curious and try to escape the ordinary. I'll see you next time.